48 hours. That's all she had left, and she didn't know it. In those final 2 days, Shanann Watts carried the weight of a marriage she was still fighting for, texting, organizing, and reassuring herself that things could get better. She moved with hope, but also with a worry she couldn't quite name. A mother holding on. A wife trying to believe. A woman unaware that time was quietly closing in around her. Meanwhile, Chris Watts was slipping into a different world entirely. His voice stayed gentle, his face stayed calm, but behind every word was a lie. Messages hidden. Feelings erased. A secret life unfolding just out of sight. He played the role of husband and father with disturbing ease, even as the truth inside him grew darker by the hour. 2 lives intertwined, yet drifting in opposite directions. One trying to save a family. One preparing to destroy it. Across these final 48 hours, every detail mattered. The unanswered texts, the late-night silences, and the shift in his eyes that nobody noticed until it was far too late. Tonight, we peel back those last moments, every move, every lie, every warning sign, and reconstruct the truth behind Shanann Watts' final 48 hours. Subscribe to Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark. In case you're new to this story, here's the fastest context you need, without slowing us down. Shanann Watts was a devoted mother, building a life she believed was worth fighting for. She shared her world openly, lovingly, and with a confidence that made people feel like they knew her even from a distance. But behind the videos and the photos, the cracks in her marriage to Chris were widening. By the summer of 2018, their relationship had become a quiet storm. Shanann sensed something was wrong. Chris insisted everything was fine. What she didn't know was that he had already stepped into an affair, already reimagined his future, and already started distancing himself from the family he once claimed was his whole world. Then came August. Her business trip. His growing secrecy. The tension no one could see until it was too late. And on the morning of August 13, 2018, the nation watched a search begin for a missing pregnant mother and her 2 little girls. A search that would expose a chilling truth and turn a seemingly ordinary husband into the center of one of the most disturbing family tragedies in modern true crime history. That's the groundwork. That's the fracture behind the final 48 hours we're about to dissect. And now, we go back into the timeline, not to retell the whole case, but to understand how every moment in those last 2 days became a warning that the world only saw in hindsight. And this is where the final 48 hours truly start. 2 days before everything collapsed, the timeline became clearer, sharper, and almost unnervingly precise. From this point on, every movement, every message, and every shift in tone between Shanann and Chris becomes part of a clock slowly winding down. Shanann was traveling, exhausted but hopeful, still trying to reconnect with Chris, still believing her family could be repaired. She didn't know she was stepping into her final hours. Hours filled with small decisions that seemed harmless at the time yet would later become critical pieces of evidence. Chris, on the other hand, was slipping further into the lie he'd built. His behavior grew colder, his responses shorter, and his attention somewhere else entirely. And with every passing hour, the gap between them widened in ways Shanann could feel, but couldn't explain. This is where we begin reconstructing everything. Not just what happened, but how it unfolded moment by moment. Because from here on, nothing is random. Nothing is meaningless. Every minute takes us closer to the truth hiding beneath Chris Watts' calm exterior. The clock has started. The countdown to the final 48 hours is officially in motion, and the story only gets darker from here. Friday night. The beginning of the end, though Shanann couldn't have sensed it. As she prepared to return home from her trip, her mind stayed on her daughters, on her marriage, and on the hope that maybe, just maybe, Chris would finally open up. She texted him with the warmth of a wife trying to bridge a growing distance. But the responses she received were colder, shorter, strangely disconnected. This was the first visible crack. While Shanann was still trying to pull her family back together, Chris was behaving like a man living 2 separate lives. His words were gentle, almost mechanically so, but the tone behind them had changed. He stopped saying, "I love you," with the ease he once had. He avoided emotional conversations. He seemed present, yet not truly there. It was subtle enough to excuse but sharp enough for Shanann to feel. She messaged him, "What's wrong? Talk to me. Are we okay?" But the man answering wasn't the husband she remembered. As Friday night settled over the house, Chris stayed strangely calm, too calm, investigators later said. His movements were quiet. His mind was elsewhere. He spent the evening planning, thinking, and drifting into a version of himself no one had fully seen before. And though he outwardly appeared normal, his emotional detachment had become impossible to hide. For Shanann, the red flags were starting to line up, but she still believed her marriage was worth saving. She still believed the changes in Chris came from stress, not from something far darker growing beneath the surface. It's in this moment, the quiet of that Friday night, that the shift becomes undeniable. The warmth in their relationship dimmed. The distance widened. And Chris's behavior took on a new, unsettling stillness. This was the night when the tone changed. The first night when Shanann, even from miles away, could feel something wasn't right. A coldness she couldn't explain. A silence she didn't deserve. And as that Friday night faded into the early hours of Saturday, the countdown continued, carrying them both toward the final 48 hours, hours that would expose everything Chris was trying so desperately to hide. Saturday morning began like any other, at least on the surface. For Shanann, it was the kind of morning she'd handled 1,000 times before, checking her messages, confirming her flight details, and thinking about getting back home to her daughters. She spoke to friends, shared quick updates, and tried to focus on the hope that things with Chris might still improve. She talked about plans, about the girls, and about normal life. Everything she did came from love and responsibility, the way she always moved through the world. But Chris was living a very different morning. While Shanann worked to hold her family together, Chris was drifting farther away from it. He answered her messages with short replies, sometimes hours apart. The warmth in his words was gone. The effort was gone. Friends who later saw these texts said the change was obvious, almost like he was trying not to feel anything at all. This was the double life in motion. Shanann's morning was filled with simple routines. Checking in about the kids, sending reminders, and making sure everything was ready for her return home. She talked about the future as if it were still solid. She planned for the week ahead, thinking of school, meals, appointments, all the regular pieces of family life. Chris's morning moved in the opposite direction. He kept deleting messages. He stayed distant. He split his attention between the family he had and the life he wanted with someone else. And the contrast between them grew clearer with every passing hour. Shanann still tried to connect. She still asked how Chris felt. She still hoped honesty would fix the gaps she could sense growing between them. But Chris responded with a coldness she didn't understand. His tone had changed. His focus had changed. And the man she once trusted completely now sounded like someone who didn't want to answer simple questions. By late morning, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Shanann was fighting for clarity. Chris was avoiding it. They were living two separate realities, under the same marriage, but no longer on the same path. Text after text showed the difference. Shanann tried to talk. Chris tried to shut the door on any real conversation. And even though nothing dramatic happened that morning, everything about it mattered. The small silences, the short answers, the distance, he didn't even try to hide anymore. Looking back, investigators would call this the turning point. The day when Chris fully slipped into the double life he'd been building, and the day Shanann realized something was deeply wrong, even if she couldn't yet see the full picture. And as the morning became afternoon, the countdown continued, pushing both of them toward the final hours that would change everything. Saturday afternoon arrived quietly, the kind of afternoon that should have felt ordinary, but didn't. Shanann went about her day with her usual determination, trying to keep her mind steady. She texted friends about coming home, talked about the girls, and tried to stay positive. But underneath her words, there was something else, a tension she couldn't quite name. She felt Chris slipping even from miles away. His tone was different. His timing was off. His excuses felt thin. Still, she kept reaching out. Still trying to talk. Still trying to understand what had changed. Meanwhile, Chris continued his pattern of distance. his messages lacked emotion. He avoided real conversations. He spoke in short, flat replies that gave nothing and revealed everything. And what's most chilling is this: no one around him noticed anything unusual. To friends, neighbors, coworkers, he seemed calm. Almost too calm. This was the part of the timeline investigators later described as the quiet before the break. The storm was building, but on the outside, everything looked normal. Shanann shared small updates with close friends, telling them she needed to talk to Chris about their marriage once she got home. She wanted honesty. She wanted clarity. She wanted the man she married to finally tell her what he was hiding. But Chris wasn't preparing for a conversation. He was preparing for control. As the afternoon slowly faded, Chris slipped deeper into his double life. He checked his phone constantly, but not for Shanann. He deleted messages with a precision that showed planning. He rehearsed responses that kept his story intact. He moved through the house with a strange, controlled stillness, the kind of stillness that, in hindsight, felt like a warning no one knew how to read. And then came Saturday evening, the hours investigators call the false calm. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing looked wrong. Chris appeared polite, relaxed, even friendly. He acted like a man who had nothing to worry about. Neighbors later said he didn't look stressed or rattled, he looked composed. But Shanann sensed the truth beneath the mask. Her messages grew more emotional, more direct. Her instinct told her something wasn't right, that Chris was holding back something big. She kept telling friends she felt disconnected from him, that he was acting weird, that something was off in a way she couldn't explain. Chris responded with the same empty calm. No warmth, no reassurance, just controlled, practiced distance. And that contrast, Shanann pleading for answers, Chris quietly avoiding them, is what made this evening so haunting. Because looking back, this was the moment when the tragedy was closest to being prevented, if honesty had been possible. If he had cracked even once. If he had let one truth slip through the lies. Instead, Saturday evening ended with a chilling stillness. Shanann hoping for clarity. Chris is avoiding it, both moving toward the final day, without realizing how little time was left. And as night settled over their home, the countdown continued into the hours that would become the most critical of the entire timeline. Saturday night settled in with the kind of calm that hides everything beneath it. The world outside grew quiet, and inside the Watts home, the distance between Chris and Shanann felt wider than ever. Yet on the surface, nothing looked unusual. Nothing looked dangerous. Nothing revealed how close they were to the point of no return. Shanann was still in North Carolina, gathering her things, preparing for her early morning flight home. She tried to stay steady, even though she felt the weight of their marriage pressing down harder than it ever had. She checked on the girls, messaged friends, and talked about her plans for the next day. She believed there was still time to fix things. She believed she could face Chris, look him in the eyes, and finally understand what had gone wrong. But Chris wasn't thinking about fixing anything. He was cleaning, organizing, preparing the house with a kind of focus that didn't match the peaceful night around him. Every movement was too controlled, too purposeful, as if he was setting a stage only he understood. He stayed on his phone more than usual, but not with Shanann. He deleted messages, cleared history, maintained the other life he didn't want exposed. And every deleted text, every hidden call, pushed the truth deeper into the back of the night. Meanwhile, Shanann tried once more to break through the wall Chris had built. She sent messages asking what was wrong, trying to reach the version of her husband she used to know. The one who laughed with her, who dreamed with her, who held their daughters like they were the center of his world. But the man on the other end of the phone wasn't that person anymore. His replies stayed cold, distant, almost mechanical. Friends later said they could feel her fear in her words. She didn't know what was coming, but she felt something was coming. Back in Colorado, the girls slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that this was the last night their mother would kiss them goodnight. Their rooms were silent, untouched, holding a gentleness that made the next day even harder to imagine. Chris walked quietly through the house, checking rooms, putting items away, and moving with a strange stillness that investigators would later call unnervingly calm. In every corner of that home, something felt wrong. A kind of silence that grows right before a life-changing moment. And hundreds of miles away, Shanann finally settled into bed for a few hours of sleep, exhausted from travel, from worry, and from the emotional strain that had followed her all week. She told friends she just wanted to get home, talk to Chris face to face, and understand what had shifted between them. It was a hopeful thought, but heartbreakingly, it would never happen. Because this peaceful night, this quiet, normal, forgettable night, was the final one before their world spun into the darkest hours of the entire timeline. A night where everything still looked normal, yet nothing truly was. Sunday morning rose softly over Frederick, Colorado, the kind of gentle sunrise that makes you believe the day ahead will be peaceful. But inside the Watts home, peace was only an illusion. Chris woke early. Too early. He moved through the house with a quiet, deliberate calm that didn't match the normal rhythm of a Sunday. Every action he took felt strangely measured, as if he was rehearsing a version of the day no one else knew about. He made small preparations, checked his phone, tied up loose ends, all while trying to maintain the shell of an ordinary husband, an ordinary father, living an ordinary life. But nothing about this morning was ordinary. Outside, the world looked exactly the same. Neighbors' sprinklers clicked on. Cars rolled out of driveways. Birds moved across the sky. It was the kind of morning where nothing felt wrong, unless you were looking closely. And Shanann was. Minutes away from boarding her flight home, she was exhausted but hopeful. Her messages to friends from the airport were filled with that familiar mix of frustration and determination. I need to fix this. I need to talk to him. I need to save my family. She didn't know she was returning to a storm already in motion. Back in Colorado, the girls padded around the house in their pajamas, innocent and unaware. They asked about breakfast. They asked about mommy. They giggled and talked the way little kids do on a calm Sunday morning. Their voices were the only pure sound inside that home. But Chris barely absorbed it. His mind was somewhere else, split between the life he had, the life he wanted, and a dark plan that had grown silently inside him for weeks. He stared into empty rooms, checked his phone again, thought about the hours ahead with a quiet intensity investigators would later describe as chilling. To the outside world, everything looked normal. A father with his daughters on a Sunday morning. A mother boarding a flight to come home to her family. A house ready for a new week to begin. But beneath every normal moment, something was shifting. The air felt heavier. Time felt tighter. And the countdown that began on Friday was now reaching its final stretch. Shanann's plane lifted into the sky. The girls played in the living room. Chris waited. And in those simple, everyday movements, a flight boarding, a child laughing, a husband standing quietly in the kitchen, the final day of their lives unfolded without a single warning loud enough to hear. Because the tragedy of this case isn't only in what happened, but in how normal the world looked right before everything fell apart. Sunday afternoon drifted in softly, calm and unthreatening, the kind of warm, quiet Colorado afternoon that should have felt peaceful. But inside the Watts home, that peace was only surface deep. Chris moved through the house like a man wearing a mask. He played with the girls, answered their questions, helped them with small things. And on the outside, he looked like any tired father passing time on a weekend afternoon. But every now and then, something slipped through, a blank stare, a long breath, a moment where he seemed to disappear into himself. He checked his phone constantly. His face tightened with every message he sent or received. Investigators later described his digital trail that day as restless, like a man pacing even while sitting still. The girls didn't notice. To them, this was just another lazy Sunday. They colored, watched cartoons, and danced around the living room. Their laughter echoed through the house, bright, innocent, unaware that these were some of their final carefree hours. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A couple watered their lawn. A dog barked down the street. Nothing about the world hinted that anything was wrong. But something was wrong. Chris's mind was split, one half performing the role of a loving father, the other drifting into a darker place. Hour by hour, the cracks widened. Every normal moment felt more strained, more rehearsed, more hollow. Meanwhile, Shanann was thousands of feet above the ground, flying home with a head full of hopes, fears, and unanswered questions. She messaged friends during her layover, worrying about the tension between her and Chris, but still believing that the conversation they'd been avoiding could be resolved face to face. She was coming home ready to fight for her marriage. She didn't know she was coming home to a man who had already let go. By mid-afternoon, the sun fell into that golden, hazy glow that usually marks the end of a calm weekend. The girls settled with snacks and toys. Chris walked from room to room, staring at things longer than usual, their little backpacks, half-finished drawings, and the framed photos on the staircase. He paused often, as if memorizing the house, as if absorbing the life he was about to destroy. These were the final hours where life still looked normal. The final hours were when nothing on the outside gave away the storm building inside one man's mind. The final hours before Shanann's world, and the world of anyone who would later hear this story, changed forever. And the most chilling part? No one noticed a thing. Sunday night settled over Frederick, Colorado like a heavy blanket, quiet, still, almost unnaturally calm. Inside the Watts home, the girls were finally getting ready for bed. Their weekend was ending like any other. Pajamas, bedtime routines, soft giggles echoing through the hallway. From the outside, the house looked peaceful. Lights glowing softly through the blinds. Nothing out of place. Nothing to warn the world of what was coming. But inside, something had shifted. According to later reports, Chris moved through the house in a strange, distant rhythm. He helped tuck the girls in, spoke softly to them, and watched them drift off to sleep. These were the last moments anyone would ever see them alive. Innocent, tired, trusting. As the night deepened, the house grew quieter. The girls slept. The neighborhood slept. Even the air outside felt still. And somewhere between that quiet and the early morning hours, Shanann's flight landed in Arizona for her final connection home. She texted friends, exhausted, emotional, and ready to talk to Chris once she walked through the door. She believed the worst they would face was a painful conversation about their marriage. She didn't know she was walking into something far darker. Her final flight touched down after midnight. She carried her purse, her suitcase, and the weight of a crumbling marriage on her shoulders as she got into the car with her friend, Nicole. The drive was quiet. Shanann talked about her worries, her hopes, her determination to fix things. To her, there was still a future to save. At exactly 1:48 a.m., the doorbell camera captured what would become one of the most haunting pieces of footage in modern true crime. Shanann walking up the driveway, holding her bags, unaware that she was taking her final steps into the life she'd built. She doesn't rush. She doesn't hesitate. She simply walks, tired, unaware, trusting. She disappears inside. From this point forward, what happened in that house comes from law enforcement reports, phone records, expert testimony, and Chris Watts' own accounts, many of which have changed over time. But the consistent facts paint a devastating timeline. Inside the home, an argument began. Tense, quiet at first, then rising as years of resentment, secrets, and lies finally collided. Shanann wasn't afraid of conflict. She wanted answers. She wanted the truth. She wanted her husband to be honest with her. But Chris wasn't the same man anymore. Reports indicate he confessed that their marriage was over. He spoke in short, cold sentences. He offered no warmth, no reassurance. Shanann pushed back, not with anger, but with heartbreak. She asked questions, demanded clarity, begged him to reconsider. She was fighting for a life that, tragically, was already slipping away. Sometime after this confrontation, in the silent, dark hours of early Monday morning, everything changed. The exact details remain known only through forensic timelines and Chris's later statements, but the results were irreversible. A home that had been filled with love, children's laughter, and dreams just 24 hours earlier became the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. By dawn, the facade of normal life had collapsed completely, but from the outside, the house still looked painfully ordinary. No sirens, no screams, no lights flashing. Just a quiet street on a quiet morning, unaware that the lives inside had been shattered forever. Monday morning began like any other on the outside. Sunlight creeping over the rooftops, sprinklers hissing across front yards, neighbors heading to work. But inside the Watts home, nothing was normal anymore. The house was silent. Too silent. And in that silence, Chris Watts began constructing the story he hoped would hold everything together. At 5 a.m., according to phone records and later investigative reports, Chris moved through the house with a cold, disturbing calm. He backed his work truck into the driveway, something he never did, loading items into the back before the sun had even risen. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary workday. But this wasn't a routine morning. This was stage one of the cover-up. By 6 a.m., he was already sending his first message, a text to Shanann's phone, knowing she would never respond. A text designed not for her, but for anyone who would later see it. A preemptive lie. Then he left the house. Drove away. Pulled into the oil field where he worked, surrounded by miles of open land and industrial equipment. A lonely, desolate backdrop for what investigators would later call an attempt to erase the truth. Back at home, hours passed quietly until the first crack appeared. Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, noticed immediately that something was off. No replies from Shanann. No updates. No morning check-ins about the kids, the day, or work. Nothing. Nicole knew Shanann didn't disappear. Not voluntarily. Not silently. By late morning, worry turned into action. She drove to the Watts home. She knocked. She rang the doorbell. She called and texted Shanann repeatedly. No answer. Meanwhile, Chris was still out at the job site, receiving messages from Nicole, messages he brushed off with calm, calculated responses. She went to a playdate. She's probably sleeping. She wasn't feeling well. Every answer was another layer of the same lie, building a wall between reality and the truth he refused to face. But the cracks were forming. Neighbors noticed his strange behavior. The lack of Shanann's SUV in motion. The unusual way he backed his truck in that morning. The coldness in his voice when he spoke. And by the time he finally arrived home to meet Nicole and the police doing a wellness check, the unraveling had already begun. He walked through the door with exaggerated shock. He opened closets dramatically. He called out Shanann's name loudly, as if performing for the officers. His phone stayed glued to his hand, screen down. What he didn't know was that every move he made was being watched by a neighbor's surveillance camera. A camera that would soon expose the first lie. A camera that captured the quiet, early morning movements Chris hoped no one would ever question. This was the beginning. The beginning of the unraveling. The beginning of the truth breaking through the cracks of a carefully constructed lie. And it was only going to get worse from here. By early Monday afternoon, the thin threads holding Chris's story together began to snap, one by one, under the weight of simple questions he couldn't convincingly answer. Officers were still inside the house, moving from room to room, noticing things that didn't line up with a typical disappearance. Shanann's purse was still there. Her medications were untouched. Her phone, the one she never went anywhere without, was found buried between the couch cushions. The excuses Chris gave started sounding more like rehearsed lines than genuine concern. She must have left with a friend. She probably needed some space. She wasn't feeling well. But detectives have a skill, spotting emotion that doesn't fit the moment. And Chris's reactions lacked something essential: fear. Real fear. The kind of fear a husband shows when his pregnant wife and 2 daughters vanish without warning. As officers stepped outside to review the neighbor's surveillance footage, the atmosphere shifted sharply. The neighbor stood beside the officer, arms folded, eyes narrowed. He shook his head slightly. "Chris never backs his truck in like that," he said. "Something's off." And then they watched the footage, that grainy, early morning recording of Chris walking back and forth to his truck, loading it in the dark before dawn. His movements were stiff, but purposeful. Nothing about it suggested a man heading out for a normal work shift. When the video stopped, the room fell quiet. The officer turned toward Chris. In that exact moment, the camera caught something important. His body language breaking. His breathing shifted. His eyes dropped to the floor. The neighbor later said, "He wasn't acting right. Not at all." Back inside the house, detectives began circling him with more direct questions. When did you last see Shanann? Why did you leave so early? Why isn't her phone with her? Why were the children's car seats still here? Each question forced Chris deeper into his own inconsistencies. Every answer contradicted the one before. And the more he tried to maintain calm, the more uneasy he appeared. The psychological pressure was building fast. His voice trembled at the wrong moments. His hands moved too much. His explanations grew shorter, vaguer, and emptier. It was becoming painfully clear. Chris Watts wasn't a worried husband. He was a man losing control of a lie. By the time officers left the house that afternoon, the tone of the investigation had shifted. This was no longer a missing persons check. It was the beginning of a full-scale inquiry, one now centered on the only person whose story made less sense by the hour: Chris himself. The collapse had begun, and within 24 hours, the entire truth would burst open, exposing everything he had tried so desperately to hide. As the sun set on that Monday, the world still didn't know the truth. But the walls around Chris Watts were already closing in. His story was cracking. His lies were buckling under even the smallest questions. And investigators were no longer asking if something was wrong, but what he had done. The final 48 hours of Shanann Watts' life, and the final hours of her daughter's lives, were filled with moments so normal, so painfully ordinary, that they've haunted millions ever since. Because nothing about their final weekend hinted at the darkness waiting just beyond the surface. And that's what makes this case unforgettable. Not just the horror of the crime, but the quietness of it. The ease with which evil hid inside routine. The way one man lived two lives until they collided in the most devastating way possible. Today, years later, people still ask the same questions. How did no one see it? How can someone hide so much behind a calm smile? And how many signs did we all miss? These are the questions that keep this case alive, not for sensationalism, but for understanding, for awareness, and for the hope that tragedies like this can be prevented. You've just watched the reconstructed final 48 hours. Every move, every lie, every moment that mattered. And this is where we close. But not where the story ends. Because here on Dark Crime Casefiles, we revisit the cases the world cannot forget. The stories that demand answers, the victims who deserve to be remembered, and the truths that refuse to stay hidden. If you want more deep-dive true crime investigations like this, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. Because here, no crime stays in the dark,